and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anisree Suresh, Geoeconomics Researcher at Takshashila Institution. Energy security is back in the public discourse lately, especially since the outbreak of conflict in the Strait of Hormuz. And we have done a lot of episodes deeply analyzing India's energy security, all the concerns that comes with being energy dependent on the region. In today's episode, we'll be looking at India's push towards ethanol blended petrol and whether it can actually improve India's energy security in the long term. We will be looking at the cost and weighing that cost against the benefits, and then we'll see whether this is the right policy pathway India should be taking to achieve its energy security goals. To help me unpack these questions, I have with me today Bhumika Sevkani. She is a research analyst with the Geostrategy team. She recently wrote a piece for the Biologic. It's the newsletter for Takshashila to analyze and examine the pathways for India's bioeconomy aspirations. So she recently wrote a piece about Ethanol Blending Programme and it's how it falls short in achieving certain goals it was set out to achieve. So before we get into the details and the analysis of it, let's set the stage before we get into the details, right? So first, I think the pilot ethanol blending program was launched in 2001. So it's been like a couple of years. We have been working on this program for a while. And I think in 2004, the government officially announced the program. And by 2006, like E5 or the 5% blending rolled out across several states. I guess that's the first pilot we did. And then by Jan 2013, the policy framework was notified in the Gazette of India with a target of achieving 5% ethanol blending across 10 states and union territories. And I think despite this, blending states stuck around 1.5% until 2014 because India simply could not produce enough ethanol from sugarcane alone at that point. Then I think in 2018, the National Policy on Biofuels came out and it widened the raw material base beyond sugarcane to maize, surplus grain, and turned ethanol production into a genuine whole of government mission from there onwards. And in 2021, the Nidhi Aayog released a roadmap after consulting with various stakeholders, what is the steps India should take to get there. And in 2021 itself, IOCL, BPCL, and HPCL invited private investment to set up dedicated ethanol plants in India. And they backed by guaranteed purchase agreements and bank financing and all those kind of things. And by the end of 2024-2025, India went from blending about 5% ethanol into petrol to hitting the 20% target 5 years ahead of the 2030 schedule that we had in mind. So that's a genuine, remarkable policy execution story right there, right? However, when we talk about ethanol blending in petrol, there are a lot of questions that comes to people's mind, from a consumer perspective, from a policy perspective, from a lot of agriculture welfare perspective and all this kind of thing. And there are also questions about engine compatibility, does this ethanol blending mandates actually, route India towards more sustainable fuel consumption, energy consumption, all this thing, and the entire pricing aspect around ethanol blending and the normal petrol, right? And the main question about all of this is what is the impact of this policy in India? So let's analyze the success story first. So based on the success of E20, the government is now considering introducing multiple blend variants such as E22, E25, and even E30, right? So while blending has definitely delivered some gains in terms of reducing the crude oil imports from especially Strait of Hormuz, region that showed that a lot of vulnerability of depending on one single source for our energy consumption, right? And also there's some benefits with foreign exchange outflows, reserving our foreign reserves itself. And scaling the program further might need a reevaluation from a lot of other perspectives. That's something that we need to discuss, right? And whether it actually represent the most effective long-term strategy for strengthening India's energy security is the most important question I think we should try to answer in this conversation. So Bhumika, why do you think going from E20 to E30 isn't just more of the same? What are your thoughts on this?
Right, Anishree. Thank you, first of all. And so, as you mentioned, right, the main narrative about introducing ethanol blending has been focused on improving India's energy security and reducing our import dependence for fuel, right? And reducing the import bill per se. But ethanol blending, including the prospect of multiple blend variants such as E22, 25, 30, as the government is still considering. I think it may not represent the most effective long-term strategy for India's energy security. While so, and I argue this mainly because while ethanol blending has delivered some gains in reducing crude oil imports and foreign exchange outflows, scaling the program further might not yield significant incremental benefits for us, right? And moreover, we already have alternative technologies, particularly electric vehicles, that have sort of reached the mass adoption stage in India, and that have a greater potential in sort of substituting the crude oil usage, right? Policies then for higher ethanol blends should be re-evaluated to assess the energy security gains and against the economic, environmental, as well as resource costs that are associated with it, right? And India's ethanol blending program has been successful in terms of the deployment speed, as you mentioned, supported, and it was mainly because it was supported by government mandates, procurement guarantees, and financial incentives as well, right? Which we will come to later in the podcast. But for its impact on petroleum consumption, let's say, over the past decade, since the E20 mandate came out, the program has saved India approximately 1.97 lakh crores in terms of foreign exchange, and it has facilitated replacement of about 245 lakh metric tons of crude oil, right? And this is as of August 2025. Now, if you look at the numbers in isolation, they sound great, but these gains so these gains look significant, particularly for a country that remains heavily import dependent on fossil fuels. But it is also important to measure them against India's crude oil import bill annually, right? So India spent close to 11 lakh crores on crude oil imports in in the year 2025 to 2026 alone. And so if you compare with the previous number, it comes to around 2%, right? So the ethanol blending program only helped displace about 2% of the current annual crude oil import bill, which is, if you look at the resources, the cost that went behind it, I think might not be justifiable, right? And as the government considers higher blending targets, given that we have excess ethanol manufacturing capacity, the flex fuel ecosystem is also beginning to develop around it. We've seen automobile manufacturers that are launching flex fuel vehicles. Just recently, Maruti Suzuki sort of claimed. Maruti Suzuki launched their flex fuel vehicle, which they claim can run on blends like E25 and can go up to E100 as well. This is the kind of ecosystem that is evolving around it. But I still think that scaling the blend further might face severe challenges, and one of the challenges might also be consumer acceptance, right? And that is one of the most immediate constraints that higher blends might face. So users are concerned about vehicle performance, fuel efficiency, reduced mileage, as well as increased maintenance costs that they've seen after E20 usage. So ethanol blended is also associated with lower mileage by users, owing to obviously reduced calorific value per liter, because ethanol per se is a less energy dense fuel than petrol. So when you blend it, the overall energy density might come down, right? And besides the consumer acceptance, there's also in the gains in terms of substitution might diminish as more ethanol is blended, right? For instance, the additional 500 crore liters of ethanol required for going from E20 to E30, this will only displace only 339 crore liters of petrol. So you won't even get that 1:1 ratio of displacement, right? So consequently, as the volume of ethanol required grows with higher blends, the simultaneous reduction in petroleum consumption increases at a much slower pace. So, from an energy security perspective, again, this raises questions about whether the substantial investments needed to produce this additional amount of ethanol are justified by the relatively modest reduction in oil imports that happens further, right? And again, the resource intensity is the third challenge that we might encounter, right? The resource intensity of ethanol production, this just further complicates its suitability for a long-term strategy. The agricultural feedstock, mainly sugarcane, maize, paddy, which is required for ethanol blending, for ethanol production, is extremely water intensive in nature to grow, right? So, just to look at a couple of figures, producing 1 liter of ethanol from rice consumes over 10,000 liters of water. And on the other hand, a liter of ethanol produced from maize consumes about 4,600 liters of water, and from sugarcane, it will consume 3,600 liters of water. So you can just, and this is just for 1 liter of ethanol. So you can just see how water intensive this resource is, right? And again, so as blending targets also increase, so does the demand for these feedstocks, right? And the Economic Survey of India 2025 to 26 also highlighted another concern beyond the resource intensity, is that the continued expansion of ethanol production could influence cultivation patterns by incentivizing, because it incentivizes farmers to shift towards energy crops at the expense of food crops, right? Now, this is again a long-term consequence, but if we are considering higher blends, I think it should also be sort of kept in mind before you sort of give it a policy push, right? So but again, the program has largely increased farmers' incomes. We've seen that, and it has provided a boost to India's biofuel ecosystem as well, as you had also studied about it, right? So, but rethinking agricultural policies such as minimum support price or the fair and remunerative price could help avoid some of the unintended consequences, right? Of I mean, it could help it could help in diversifying for farmers. They can switch from highly water intensive crops to crops that use less water, things like that. So we know that there is a sustainable option as well, right? So but this also points to an overlap of agricultural policies in this scenario, right? And Anisree, you have studied about the agricultural policies in past extensively, I know that. So could you briefly explain about these overlapping issues as well, which comes with the fair and remunerative prices?
Yeah, so I actually want to start with some of the points that you already covered. One, that like the consumer acceptance for ethanol blended program, and like how incentivized consumers are to use this, right? So one major aspect that you have to consider here is like the pricing aspect. Right now, ethanol blended petrol and the normal petrol is like priced at the same time, only because it's like mandated right now. Like people are using. There's no like natural demand, market demand for ethanol blended program at this point. So how do you like make consumers incentivized for them? You need to adjust the pricing. But if you look at the pricing aspect, the government has like I think recently came out with like a Q&A thing on the ethanol blended program, and they said that this is kind of to give that a good welfare or like a pricing mechanism for the farmers who produce the sugarcane and everything. However, the problem when you have like the different mandates for one single policy, it kind of contradicts in terms of its mandate, right? One, you want to move towards more sustainable sources of oil, sustainable source of energy, and then you, as part of the mandate you're putting, you want to give good welfare. Pricing for the farmers who are producing the sugarcane. So that's the one contradiction here. The second part, I think, in this thing also you mentioned that like the energy security, I mean the food security angle, where you feel like as we move ahead in terms of like how much blended ethanol that you want to use and everything, the more the mandate gets up, like 30%, 40%, whatever that we want to achieve, The problem is like you would have an incentive for farmers to move away from this thing. Again, that's like, that's, if you want to look at it from an energy security perspective, it's a very different equation. If you want to look at it from a pure food security aspect, then it's a problem. I mean, different thing. Because again, it's all kind of an overall ecosystem that you have to study, right? You can't study these sectors like independently from each other, not in isolation. It doesn't happen, because all of the policies in different sectors, whether it's from agriculture, from the start of sugarcane production, to moving up to the how the sugar mills are functioning in India, and then how the ethanol blending is happening, and then like till the point that it reaches consumption consumers, it's an entire like a life cycle that you have to kind of see, like what all policies kind of create unintended consequence that's actually going against the policies and the outcomes that you want to achieve in that entire life cycle. So let's start with like how sugarcane, that's a major feedstock for ethanol blending at this point, at least for the first generation ethanol that we are talking about. So to understand this friction itself, you have to go back and say like when the fair remunerative prices or the minimum support prices was like introduced, and how it was incepted into the agriculture. So it was back in 1960s. I feel like it was introduced at a period when India was facing severe food security issues, and you had crippling shortages, and administered pricing was a kind of a masterstroke to adjust this challenge, right? So the goal back then was quite simple: incentivize farmers to grow high calorie dense crops by guaranteeing a risk free return. So that's the goal that we wanted. However, with that policy, yes, we were able to address the food security issues back then in the 1960s and 70s, which leading to the green revolution and all those kind of things that happened. However, a policy that was designed to combat starvation in the 20th century is fundamentally mismatched in the 21st century in terms of the industrial aspirations that we have, in terms of like bioeconomy initiative, innovation, and R&D that we want. So there's a mismatch that's happening with a policy that came back in the 1960s without a sunset clause, have continued to have a lot of unintended consequences in the 21st century, right? Like while I get the point that like this is a policy for farmer welfare, but if you actually analyze the demand and supply equation in this issue, like you understand that there's a paradox that exists, right? One, it clearly disconnects farmers from the ethanol bloom or the benefits that they would gain from a blooming market. So in a standard economic framework, when you have a minimum support price or a FRP for this instance, it acts as a price floor, right? It's a legal minimum price. Everything has to be above that. So it's a price floor in that demand supply equation that we have. While it's designed to protect farmers and give them maximum remuneration from this, in a booming market where you have like demand for sugarcane and sugarcane based feedstock is like growing at a rapid pace, it ironically acts as a rigid anchor that prevents them from capturing the true market value out of it. So let's little bit more get into the details. Like one, you have a skyrocketing demand because it's just not ethanol now. No? Now there's a mandated ethanol, so that means the sugarcane demand for sugarcane is going up, and also along with the ethanol blending program, there are also other growing sectors within the bioeconomy, right? Like bioplastics, green chemicals, and sustainable aviation fuel. Like the options are growing as we are exploring and experimenting with these sectors. So the industrial appetite for sugarcane is like surging at a very rapid pace. But if you look at the supply aspect of it, so the demand curve is definitely like moving right, and there's a lot of like demand for it. But if you look at the supply aspect of it, to protect the domestic market, India placed, I think, import restrictions on ethanol for fuel purposes from 2019 onwards. So you have the supply graph that's moving left. So the supply is like, it's restricted. There's a limitation of the supply there. So this essentially gives domestic sugarcane a captive high demand market. So your demand is growing and your supply is restricted. So ideally, in any kind of any market scenario, your prices should be shooting up. Prices should be really going well. It should be going skyrocketing all through the roof. However, because we have the fair remunerative prices and the minimum support prices, it sets a rigid state administered pricing structure, and farmers are decoupled from the market, right? So they do not benefit from the premium profits otherwise would have generated by this ethanol mandates and bioplastics or any of these sectors bloom in that sense. Instead, the value is kind of trapped within that supply chain, while mills face financial stress trying to meet the rigid mandate during down cycles. And there are a lot of other or unintended consequences. Not just, I'm saying, from the pure farmer's perspective itself, this
Mm.
policy is not really benefiting as it was intended to be. The mandate of is like farmers' welfare. I still feel like it's not even serving that purpose. Now, if you look at the other unintended consequences, there are multiple, right? One, is the problem with this, like, the water issue that you spoke of, like,
Yeah.
how many of these sugar canes are, like, intensely consuming water. And if you look at the places in India where you have the most of the sugar cane farms, that's the places where you have, like, not a lot of, like, rainwater to kind of address this, like, water issues. Like, if it's water consuming, then it should be in the place where you get a lot of water, right?
Mm.
But unfortunately, that's not the policies. Because of FRP and all these things, our farms are not really optimized for this, like, how much rainwater you're getting, all those kind of things. So you have that issues. And since government sets a relatively uniform flatline pricing for all sugarcane varieties, there's no, like, much of a distinction between different varieties. It completely disincentivizes farmers from adopting, like, alternative or genetically engineered or, like, higher sugarcane varieties where you can get maximum optimization for ethanol or any of this mills that produces various products, byproducts of, like, sugarcane processing.
Mm.
And you get, like, same old water consuming sugarcane varieties what we are producing in large, right? So sugarcane is notoriously water intensive. So, as India pushes for massive ethanol production, the massive water footprint of traditional cane varieties threatens this green credential that we are talking about with the
Yeah.
ethanol blending and everything, right? And because the FRP guarantees that same price regardless of the crop's ecological footprint, you're not matching that, you're not actually assessing the entire, like, carbon footprint or ecological footprint this product is making. So, farmers have no financial reason or no incentive for that matter to switch to an eco-friendly variety. Or, and basically that means, like, you're stalling the entire agricultural R&D right there. So that's why you're
Mm.
not able to move up the value chain in that sense, right? Now, other issues, like, I think recently the government had a notification on the sugarcane control order, kind of amending the 1966 order. And in the new order, even the all the ethanol blending, I mean ethanol making mills are basically considered under this order right now. And there is a clause within the sugarcane control order which basically says that, it kind of binds farmers in a particular region within a particular geography, to sell exclusively to a designated local sugar mill, or like a any sugar mill includes now the ethanol
Mm.
producing mills as well. So concurrently, what happens is, like, the specific mill is legally obligated to buy all the cane produced in within that geographic zone. So while this has originally intended to kind of ensure a steady supply of cane to mills and to ensure that the farmers are getting paid because there's a steady supply, now what it's created is like a kind of a monopoly, in the sense, like, you have one market and one buyer.
Yeah.
The unintended consequences of this is, like, huge. You have no competition, there's no premium, you don't get money beyond the FRP that's set by the government. And even if you have a mill that's, like, maybe 50 kilometers apart from your farm, it's profitable, they're using state of the art ethanol blending distillery, and they want to buy more cane at a premium price, the farmer cannot sell it to them. So that's an unintended consequence it's being created, right? So this completely destroys competition within ethanol blending mills, ethanol within sugarcane mills, and all this kind of. And it strips farmer of their bargaining power. They have no negotiating power in the market. It's set by the government, and they stick to it. And they're kind of completely dependent on the FRP. So they continue to demand FRP because that's the way, feel like this is the only thing that we can actually get out of it. And even if the mill, the ethanol distillery or the sugarcane mill is, like, not so competitive, not so efficient, they're, like, not really doing well, and they're delaying the payments, or any of these issues comes, they're stuck in that process because of these clause, right?
Mm.
So ultimately, if you're looking at not just ethanol blending, largely any of this industrial processing of this agriculture feedstock, I think you require a dynamic, sustainable agriculture sector with, a lot of competition, a lot of the aspiration to move up the high, value chain within that agriculture sector, right? And that's the only way you kind of reach that potential. If you want to, if you have a mandate for like you move towards ethanol blending and everything, without addressing these challenges, I don't think it's possible for us to move up and say like, okay, this is what we want to do. There are a lot of issues, and yes, in a political economy like India, we do have to consider and deliver in terms of like what we promise to farmers. They are also part of the economy that they're contributing. However, you also have to see like whether we need to be stuck in the 1960s era of like all those rules and laws, or should we move up the value chain in terms of like what we can actually give them the best and take the most out of the situation. And yeah, like we mentioned, even the pricing is also like you cannot have different mandates for one policy. So if the policy of ethanol blending is to have more energy security, reduce import dependence and all this kind of thing, then you cannot mix it with agriculture welfare at this point. That's a different policy. So we need to have like single mandate for single policy, and that's a good policy design in that sense.
No, coming to the policy design that you mentioned, right? I think this whole conversation about how it affects the different actors in this supply chain, right?
Yeah.
We looked at the farmers, the consumers, and everything. So, but it also gives us a sort of, I think, the perfect case study to it shows us how to think about any of the big infrastructure or fuel policies that whose impact goes beyond sort of the stated objective, right?
Yeah.
It has a sector wide impact, right? So I mean, it'd be great if you could put it in simpler terms to understand how to look at such policies and not to basically not to look at it in isolation like that.
So yeah, I think you pretty much answered the question itself. Like the honest answer to this is like, if is it a good policy, whether it has achieved its objective. Never look inside one market. Like what are you have to anticipate the unintended consequences of that policy across the ecosystem, right? And it has ripple effect. What happens in one market has ripple effects across the connected markets, the adjacent markets, in that sense. So simple rule for rule of thumb for listeners is, whenever you hear a policy justified by its effect in just one number, like oil import saved, emissions avoided, jobs created, actually go beyond that and ask like but whether it had any unintended consequences. What is the cost and benefit, like whether the benefits justifies the costs that it took. Of course, we, from a pure energy security perspective, yes, we might have to think of all the diversification or opportunities. You might have to think of the alternative, the substitutions that you can think of. All those things is definitely there. And I think I strongly believe that like the long-term energy security goal for India is the diversification. But what is the best diversification part that you can think of is the thing that you really had.
Yeah, this I mean, basically looking at other alternatives that exist, right?
Yeah,
and what are their effects on the stated goal, as well as alternatives that have, I think, the minimum sort of minimum unintended consequences, but would be none at all would be the best. But are there any existing alternatives that can provide greater benefits in both fuel substitution as well as adjacent industries, right? And speaking of that, I think the main sort of the main case that India was referring to while looking at while kickstarting our own ethanol blending program was Brazil's success, right? So I was just trying to understand what Brazil's success looks like. So they also started it. Their ethanol blending program also started in about 1975, which was after the 1973 oil embargo, and therefore the supply crisis that they also faced, right? But back then, Brazil's program was supported by low sugar prices and excess distillation capacity, right? Even today, Brazil produces a lot of sugar, right? But one more thing that Brazil did, which I think also should have been implemented in India, is the retail pricing, right? So Brazil followed a different retail model from India. What they did was consumers could choose between petrol blended with around 27% ethanol, E27, and hydrous ethanol, which is E100. And pricing often favored the hydrous ethanol, and which was basically 25 to 35% lower than blended petrol, right? Which made it an attractive option for consumers, which then led to a demand spike. And then consumers also started adopting the flex fuel vehicles because of this, right? So I think just that one tweak in terms of retail pricing
Yeah.
also sort of is where Brazil got a lot of its advantage. But then, but then it's very important to keep the end goal in mind. The end goal here for India, I think, should be diversifying our energy consumption mix as much as possible, so that we're not reliant on one source of fuel for majority of our consumption, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you look at that diversification mix, we also have other options like EVs. We have which offer a greater benefit in terms of your industrial competitiveness, as well as in terms of fuel substitution, right? But even in terms of biofuels, we have compressed biogas, which again offers greater benefits in terms of both substitution, will help us reduce our import reliance in natural gas. Again, we import 50% of our
Yeah.
natural gas consumption as well, right? So these are the alternatives, I think, that should be explored alongside ethanol,
Yeah.
rather than focusing so much of our resources into one sort of.
I totally
Yeah.
agree. I think the one key takeaway probably from this discussion for me personally is also, while yes, it's a success story so far, we have been able to do a lot. But I think the caveats here is like, if you don't kind of address the supply chain issues along the entire ecosystem, I don't think we'll be able to reach the next milestone without a lot of like, unintended consequences for that matter. One, yes, groundwater, and let's look at the sustainability from the like, the entire life cycle of that product, right? From producing sugarcane to the end consumption, are we really like, sustainable in that sense, if you're talking about sustainability? Second, let's not mix two different mandates with one policy. I think there needs to be some kind of clear distinction on what exactly this policy wants to achieve. Is it farmers' welfare, or is it like, reduce the import dependence? So I think that kind of clarification gives us much more like, to reach the next milestone of like, what you really want to achieve. You want to give that incentive to consumers to like, to have a choice and choose between what you really want to do.
Right.
And yes, like you said, diversification, more like, let's think about a very diversified energy plan for India, in the sense like, from the LPGs to like, moving towards more sustainable options of it, the biogas thing that you spoke of, and the various other options. And thirdly, the bioeconomy itself, it's a growing economy, growing sector in the and India has a lot of potential to contribute to that sector and grow from it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of like, steps to kind of reform the entire ecosystem in a way that it benefits the consumers, it benefits the producers, it benefits the people in the entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was a really great discussion, Bhumika, and thank you so much for providing your insights into this. And I hope you got a lot of like, our listeners got a lot of understanding of the topic and the subject. If you want to know more about bioeconomy and what should India's policies, pathways to get there, to build a 300 billion economy around bioeconomy, please subscribe and check out our newsletter, The Biologic. It's available in Substack. That's Akshishila's policy pathways in terms of building that bioeconomy sector. Thank you, everyone.